Tantor Audio presents A Wrestling Life, The Inspiring Stories of Dan Gable, by Dan Gable, with Scott Schulte, narrated by Joe Barrett. Introduction. Dan Gable. Olympic Wrestling Trials, April 2012. Carver Hawkeye Arena Floor, Iowa City, Iowa. A writer named Scott Schulte approached me recently and started a conversation. He caught me in an emotional state, just as the Hawkeyes' last chance to make the Olympic freestyle team was lost when Brent Metcalf dropped a match by a criteria tiebreaker. It was especially tough because 75% of the sold-out crowd that day were Iowa fans and thought Metcalf had actually won, only to be disappointed by the result. While it was already an emotional moment, Scott brought up the possibility of doing an article for an internet media outlet about another very difficult subject from my personal life, my sister's murder when I was a teenager. I agreed, and as that project developed, Scott suggested we do a book of Gable short stories. Having many such stories from over the years, I thought it was a good idea, but I figured it would only end up being all talk and that nothing would come of it. But before long, we were actually getting work done. Since Scott lived in Connecticut at the time of putting this book together, I was able to learn to be more tech-active, which is a good thing, I think. So I am now officially more educated and can hopefully bring my message to the masses in more positive ways. So here we are. Enjoy. I still have many more stories that are worthwhile, enjoyable, and educational, so if this goes well, maybe you can look for a second book, since there's so much that we had to leave out. Besides, I'm still creating stories, because my work is never done. Introduction. Scott Schulte. I've made a career out of telling stories. On most occasions, they are stories I enjoy telling. I get to meet interesting people and convey their experiences. The stories I tell have landed on the pages of newspapers and magazines, and I've always said, what a great job I have. Through such experiences, I developed an idea for a different kind of biographical book, much like the one you are hearing now. As I imagined it, each chapter was going to be a standalone story from the person's life, a kind of snapshot or highlight. This way you could get the chance to hear about the exciting or important parts of a person's life without all of the extra and sometimes unnecessary details. After hashing out the details of how I would create such a book, I was faced with the challenge of finding a person I found interesting and whose name was big enough to carry a full book of stories. Then I went to the 2012 U.S. Olympic Wrestling Trials. We all have childhood heroes. For me, there were many individuals who stood out in my young mind. No one was more important than my father and mother. Even as a young person and teenager, they were my heroes. But the athlete I admired most was the great Dan Gable. I was a wrestler, and as someone who graduated from high school in 1982, wrestling began and ended with Gable. Everything I heard in practice or at camps and clinics would always somehow include a story of him. If I did not have posters and cutouts for magazines of the legend, I might not have believed that he actually existed. I would have just figured he was some mythic figure. Growing up, I was at a few clinics where Gable instructed. I never approached him, but I was once used as the practice dummy as he instructed a move. The move hurt, but I didn't care. I was hanging out with Dan Gable. When I served my Mormon mission to Los Angeles, the 1984 Olympics were held there, and I was fortunate to see the freestyle wrestling competition. Coaching the team was none other than Dan Gable. When the opportunity came to actually meet Gable at the 2012 Olympic Trials in Iowa City, I took it. My initial desire was to write an article about the murder of Gable's sister, Diane, and how it affected his life in wrestling. I was nervous, but I had a job to do, and I did it. That went well, so I eventually asked him about this book idea, and he said yes. Thus, I was given the opportunity to write a book with and about my childhood sports hero. This has been one of the most exciting experiences of my life. Dan Gable has now gone from favorite sports figure to friend. And I can say this, as great as Dan Gable has always been as my favorite sports figure, he's an even better friend. 1. Growing up. My father always had a proud look in his eye when people would ask him, "When did you know your son was going to be a great wrestler?" The story he always told in response goes like this. I was born on October 25th, 1948, in Waterloo, Iowa, and our family's house at that time was small. Soon after being brought home from the hospital, my father, Mac, heard me crying in my crib one night. When he made his way from the bedroom to my crib, he found me on my back, fighting to get off of it. I was actually bridging up on my head to get off my back. Even at just a couple of days old, I wanted nothing to do with being on my back. As I became a toddler, my parents' drinking sometimes led to yelling and even violence. They were not alcoholics, but we had occasional visits from the local police. For whatever reason, I took to sucking my thumb and twisting my hair around my finger. When my parents went out for the evening, I would sit by the front window, waiting for them to return, with my thumb in my mouth and my finger in my hair. I think I worried because when they were at home, I at least knew they were there, which was a little bit of a comfort. When they would go out, though, I worried about them, and when they would come home. So, like lots of kids, I sucked my thumb. But I twisted my hair, too. Though unlike most, this habit continued into first grade, and even took on a new and somewhat odd twist. I would sit at my desk and suck my thumb with my left hand and play with the hair of the person in front of me with my right hand. My teacher tried to get me to stop and ended up having to chase me around the classroom. My parents also tried different ideas to get me to stop, and even got my pediatrician involved. He gave my parents this stuff to put on my thumb that tasted awful. I just sucked the bad-tasting stuff off and kept on sucking my thumb. Then it stopped. There was no great or profound solution other than me deciding to stop sucking my thumb. I guess I just snapped out of it or no longer needed that habit. Either way, my parents and teacher were relieved. The corn stalks swayed in the gentle Iowa summer breeze above me. I was about 4 years old and was hiding in a cornfield, giggling as my mother Katie and my big sister Diane called my name. They were searching the stalks for me, but whenever they got too close, I scurried deeper into the field. The corn was about 6 feet high, so it was hard to find me, and I knew it. I was determined not to be found. They were pretty mad at me, and rightfully so. Earlier that day, I sat in the back seat of our family's convertible as my mom and sister drove down a long road flanked by cornfields. It was a perfect day for a drive with the top of the car down. I was bored just sitting there, so I grabbed Diane's purse and started playing with it. I held it up in the air. The wind from the drive caught it, and it went flying. My mother immediately hit the brakes, and Diane started to chastise me. I knew I was in trouble, so I did the only thing I could think of and ran off to hide in the cornfield. My mom and Diane quickly found the purse in the ditch next to the road, but finding me was another question. The late-season cornstalks were a perfect place for a little boy to hide, and so the search began. It took them over an hour to finally find me, and when they did, I was really in trouble. This being many decades ago, the punishment was fast and swift. Let's just say there were definitely consequences. My cornfield adventure was not my first, nor my last. I was never one to hurt people or do anything illegal, but I was a little devil. I certainly kept my parents on their toes. On one occasion, when I was about 5 years old, our family made a trip to Black's department store in downtown Waterloo. Back then, the elevators were run by an operator. As the four of us crowded into the store's elevator with several strangers, the operator asked, "Which floor, please?" I was the smallest in the group and knew where we were going, and I quickly yelled out, "5th floor, bastard!" Swearing was a common part of my parents' vocabulary, but my mother quickly shushed me, and my father scowled, embarrassed. No one else said anything as the elevator moved slowly from floor to floor. At each level, a bell sounded, and upon reaching the 5th floor, the elevator stopped and the door opened. Some people walked out, and I followed them. Then I looked back and saw that my family was still on the elevator as the doors were closing. They were angry with me for embarrassing them and stayed on the elevator to teach me a lesson. Things were certainly different then than they are today. I was so mad and upset. When I turned back around, there was an older lady bent over right in front of me. I just reacted and took a chomp on her rear. To this day, I don't really remember why. She screamed, and that was the end for me. I knew I was in really big trouble. A small crowd of store employees and shoppers came quickly to see what all the fuss was about. I had just bitten a complete stranger and was now in the hands of even more strangers. Fear began to wash over me, and I didn't know what to do. I was scared to death. Finally, my parents and sister came back to the 5th floor to claim me, and when they found out that I had bitten a lady, they were even madder than they were before. This being the 1950s, when we got out to the car, my father popped me on the head with his ring finger. Later at home, my mom used a ruler to show her displeasure. As I mentioned earlier, my parents occasionally became a little hostile toward one another after a few beers. Most of the time this was limited to shouting matches, but the police did make quite a few trips to our residence to settle things down and step in when needed. One winter night, though, my parents were having a little scuffle after a few drinks, and it escalated to the point where the police came to our home. Normally, the police left after calming things down. This night, however, the police took my father with them and put him in the squad car. Being in early elementary school and not understanding the situation, I was quite upset. But I had a plan. One of the police officers who took my father away was a neighbor of ours, and he had a son in my class at school. I was going to teach this particular police officer a lesson. The police officer's son and I always walked home together after school. The next day, as we were walking home, I wrestled him to the ground, tied his wrists together, and escorted him to his front door. That night, the police officer made another stop at our house. This time, though, I was the topic of conversation. I certainly got in trouble for that one. I later found out that my father's visit to the police station that night was just to get him out of the house for a few hours to settle down. There were no charges against him, and he wasn't actually arrested. They just played a friendly card game to get him back in the right frame of mind. I learned a valuable lesson that day. Make sure you have all your facts before reacting. Like many young boys, I considered getting a haircut to be on the same scale as getting a tooth pulled, with the haircut maybe even leading the way in things I hated. My mother gave me my first haircuts to save money. Eventually, though, there came a time when she wanted to take me to the barber shop for my haircut. The day of my first barbershop haircut, I rode in the back seat of the convertible as my mother and older sister drove me to a Waterloo barber shop. It was cold out, so we had to keep the roof up as we drove. I did not want to get my hair cut, and I was going to make it as impossible as I could. I had been planning the whole car ride, so when my mother parked in front of the barber shop, I was ready. When my mom and Diane got out of the car, I quickly pushed down the 2 lock buttons on the inside of the door. My mother had left the keys inside the car, and since it was cold outside, the windows were up. It was just click, click, and I was locked inside. No haircut. I was feeling pretty good about myself, locked in the car for the moment. Outside, my mother, Diane, and the barber, along with several of his other customers, created quite a scene as they tried, without success, to get me to unlock the doors. This went on for some time, until I realized I was getting cold. But before I gave in, I heard a click, and the door popped open. My father had the spare key, and I was in trouble. Spankings were allowed, and I got one that day. I definitely deserved it. After that, though, I was immediately put back in the car and taken home. Victory! I may have gotten a spanking, but I didn't end up getting a haircut. To teach a young hellion like me some lessons, my parents turned to the Young Men's Christian Association as a place to instill good values and help burn off some of my childhood energy. This was where I was first introduced to several different sports, including wrestling. My first days at the YMCA led to another incident of childhood antics, however. I had just gotten done with wrestling practice, and it had gone really well for me. I was in a good mood and was waiting for
Sample complete. Ready to continue?